Hidden among the rolling hills of Delaware stands a mansion unlike any other in the United States. Winterthur is not a palace built to impress from the outside, nor a monument to architectural excess. Instead, it is something far more unusual and far more powerful. It is a house that disappears into history. At first glance, Winterthur appears to be a country estate shaped by old money and quiet refinement. But once inside, the building dissolves. Walls surrender to centuries. Corridors become timelines. Every room opens not into another space, but into another moment in American life. This is not a museum that displays history. It allows you to walk through it. Winterthur is the life's work of Henry Francis du Pont, a man who did not simply collect American decorative arts, but constructed an entire universe around them. Furniture, textiles, silver, ceramics, and architectural fragments were not gathered as isolated masterpieces. They were assembled as complete environments, rooms designed to feel lived in, inhabited, and emotionally intact. The result is one of the most ambitious cultural projects ever undertaken in the United States. What makes Winterthur extraordinary is not scale alone, but intention. This mansion was never meant to glorify its owner. Instead, the house itself becomes a vessel, a silent framework built to hold the memory of a nation. Here, the architecture steps back, allowing craftsmanship, domestic life, and material culture to speak in their own voices. Outside, over 1,000 acres of gardens unfold in carefully choreographed sequences, mirroring the interior's philosophy. Nature is not ornamental here. It is curated, paced, and emotionally composed. Just like the rooms inside, the landscape tells a story, one that changes with light, season, and movement. In this video, we will step inside Winterthur to explore how a private obsession became a public treasure. We will uncover the psychology of its creator, the illusion and authenticity behind its famous rooms, the hidden labor of conservation, and the deeper question Winterthur quietly asks every visitor. How does a nation choose to remember itself? This is the story of a mansion that does not celebrate wealth, but preserves time. Henry Francis du Pont did not collect objects the way most wealthy Americans did. He did not buy art to decorate a house, to signal status, or to compete socially. Instead, he did something far more radical. He built a house around his collection and then disappeared inside it. Born into the Dupont dynasty, one of the most powerful industrial families in American history, Henry Francis du Pont inherited wealth on a scale few could imagine. But unlike many heirs of Gilded Age fortunes, he had little interest in public life, politics, or social spectacle. His ambition was quieter, deeper, and infinitely more obsessive. He wanted to preserve America itself, not its grand myths, but its lived interiors. From an early age, Dupont was fascinated by the objects that surrounded everyday life. Chairs worn smooth by generations, handmade textiles faded by sunlight, silver shaped by anonymous craftsmen. He believed that these objects carried memory in a way paintings and monuments could not. To him, decorative arts were not decoration. They were evidence. This belief shaped everything about Winterthur. Dupont did not collect isolated masterpieces. He hunted for entire environments. He bought rooms, staircases, mantels, doorways, sometimes salvaged from houses that were about to be demolished. These fragments of vanished America were then reassembled inside Winterthur with almost surgical precision. The goal was never theatrical drama. The goal was believability. What makes Dupont's approach so unusual, even today, is that he rejected the idea of the visible collector. There are no grand portraits of himself dominating the walls. No plaques boasting of his genius. In fact, the more complete Winterthur became, the more invisible he made himself. His personality survives only through his curatorial choices. The height of a chair, the softness of light, the silence between rooms. Psychologically, Dupont was a man deeply uncomfortable with chaos and modernity. He distrusted industrial mass production, rapid change, and the loss of craftsmanship. Winterthur became his answer to a world moving too fast. By freezing domestic life at its most intimate level, he believed he could protect something essential about American identity. Yet this was not nostalgia in the shallow sense. Dupont was ruthlessly selective. He rejected objects that felt too perfect, too untouched, too museum-like. He wanted wear, use, and imperfection, signs that an object had been part of real human lives. In this way, Winterthur feels uncannily alive. Beds seem recently slept in. Chairs feel momentarily vacated. The house exists in a permanent present tense. Dupont lived most of his adult life inside this carefully controlled universe. As the collection expanded, the original mansion receded. Rooms multiplied. Corridors lengthened. The building stopped functioning like a house and began functioning like a mind. His mind. Winterthur became a physical manifestation of how one man believed history should be remembered. Quietly, domestically, and without spectacle. When Dupont finally opened Winterthur to the public, it was not an act of generosity alone. It was an act of confidence. He believed his vision was not personal. It was national. He trusted that future generations would understand what he was trying to preserve, even if they no longer lived the lives represented in these rooms. Today, every visitor who walks through Winterthur is, in effect, walking through Henry Francis du Pont's inner world. Not his ego, but his fears, values, and hopes. The house does not ask you to admire him. It asks you to slow down, observe, and remember. In that sense, Dupont did not just collect history. He chose to live inside it, and then invited the nation to follow. Most museums ask you to look at objects. Winterthur asks you to enter them. What makes Winterthur radically different from every other mansion or decorative arts museum in America is a single, deceptively simple idea. Objects should never be displayed alone. They should exist exactly as they once did. Inside rooms, surrounded by other objects, under the same light, proportions, and spatial logic that originally gave them meaning. This idea became known as the room ensemble concept, and it quietly revolutionized museum design worldwide. Before Winterthur, decorative arts were treated like trophies. A chair sat on a pedestal. A teapot rested behind glass. Furniture was isolated, flattened, stripped of context. Henry Francis du Pont believed this approach destroyed the soul of the objects. A chair, he argued, makes no sense without a table nearby. A table means nothing without a room, and a room only becomes real when it feels inhabited. So Dupont did something no American collector had ever done at this scale. He built entire rooms around his artifacts. Not replicas, not stage sets, but immersive environments assembled from real architectural fragments, original materials, and period-correct proportions. Walls, floors, ceilings, fireplaces, staircases, everything worked together as a single historical organism. Walking through Winterthur, you don't move from gallery to gallery. You move from world to world. One moment you are inside a modest New England parlor. The next, a formal Philadelphia drawing room. Each space has its own emotional temperature, its own rhythm, its own unspoken rules. And here's the part most visitors never realize. These rooms are not frozen in perfection. Dupont deliberately avoided symmetry and polish. Chairs are slightly misaligned. Objects are placed as if someone stood up moments ago. The rooms feel paused, not staged. This subtle disorder is intentional and psychologically powerful. Your brain stops reading the space as a museum and starts reading it as life. This approach demanded extreme control. Lighting was calibrated to mimic daylight from specific windows. Floor heights were adjusted to match regional building practices. Even the width of doorways was historically accurate, forcing visitors to move their bodies differently from room to room. Without realizing it, you begin to inhabit the past rather than observe it. The mansion itself becomes secondary. The original Winterthur house is no longer the star, it is merely a container. Architecture submits to content. This inversion is one of Dupont's most radical decisions. In traditional mansions, rooms exist to glorify the building. At Winterthur, the building exists to disappear. The influence of this idea cannot be overstated. Museums around the world adopted variations of the room ensemble after Winterthur proved its effectiveness. But few achieved the same emotional realism because Dupont was not chasing spectacle. He was chasing credibility. Critics have long debated whether these rooms are authentic, since many are assembled from parts of different houses. But this question misses the point. Winterthur is not reconstructing specific addresses. It is reconstructing patterns of life. The goal is cultural truth, not architectural purity. This is why Winterthur feels unsettling in the best possible way. You are constantly aware that history is not distant here. It is intimate. It surrounds you. It presses in from all sides. And once you experience it, traditional museums begin to feel strangely hollow. By turning a mansion inside out and transforming rooms into historical arguments, Winterthur didn't just change how collections are displayed. It changed how history is felt. If Winterthur were stripped of its rooms, its gardens, and even its mansion, it would still stand as one of the most important cultural institutions in the United States, for a single reason. Its collection of early American decorative arts is unmatched anywhere in the world. This is not a superlative used lightly. Winterthur holds more than 90,000 objects, spanning nearly 3 centuries of American life, from the earliest colonial settlements to the dawn of industrialization. Furniture, textiles, silver, ceramics, metalwork, folk art, clocks, tools, and household objects fill the collection. But numbers alone do not explain its power. What makes this collection extraordinary is its depth. Most museums display the best examples, the most refined, the most elegant, the most expensive. Winterthur does something far more ambitious. It preserves the entire spectrum of American making, rural and urban, wealthy and modest, refined and rough. You don't just see how elites lived. You see how America functioned. A single chair at Winterthur might represent a regional woodworking tradition. Another reveals trade routes through imported wood. A third shows how European design ideas were misunderstood, adapted, and eventually transformed into something distinctly American. This collection tells stories not through labels, but through accumulation and comparison. Henry Francis du Pont was obsessed with completeness. He didn't want one masterpiece from a style. He wanted 10 variations. He wanted to see how designs evolved, how techniques migrated, how tastes shifted over time. This approach turned Winterthur into a laboratory of material culture rather than a trophy room of elite objects. Take American furniture, for example. Winterthur's holdings allow scholars to trace the evolution of form, proportion, and craftsmanship with astonishing precision. You can see when American makers stopped copying European models and began asserting confidence in their own designs. That moment, quiet, gradual, and undocumented in written history, exists physically in these objects. Textiles offer an even more intimate record. Bed hangings, quilts, carpets, and embroidered samplers preserve domestic labor that was rarely acknowledged or valued in its time. At Winterthur, these objects are treated not as craft, but as cultural documents. They speak of gender roles, economic status, regional identity, and personal expression, all stitched into fabric. Even objects considered mundane, kitchenware, tools, lighting devices, are elevated here, not by presentation, but by context. Placed within room ensembles, they regain their original purpose. You begin to understand how people cooked, cleaned, gathered, and rested. History stops being abstract. It becomes practical. What's most striking is how American identity emerges not through grand symbolism, but through repetition and variation. Again and again, you see evidence of adaptation. Imported styles simplified, materials substituted, ornament reduced. American decorative arts are defined not by luxury, but by problem solving. Winterthur's collection also exposes the myth of a single American aesthetic. There isn't one. There are dozens, shaped by geography, trade, religion, immigration, and economy. The collection doesn't resolve these contradictions. It preserves them. In this way, Winterthur functions less like a museum and more like a historical archive you can walk through. Objects become sentences. Rooms become chapters. Together, they form a physical narrative of how a young nation learned to express itself through what it made and how it lived. To understand early America, not its politics or wars, but its values, anxieties, and daily rhythms, there is no richer source than this collection. It is American history told at human scale, through the things people touched every day. At Winterthur, nothing is fake, and almost nothing is exactly what it appears to be. Visitors often assume they are walking through perfectly preserved historic rooms, frozen in place for centuries. The truth is far more fascinating. Many of Winterthur's most convincing spaces are carefully constructed illusions, assembled from fragments of multiple houses, eras, and locations. And yet, they feel more real than many authentic historic homes. This paradox sits at the heart of Winterthur's genius. Henry Francis du Pont understood something most museums still struggle with. Authenticity is not the same as originality. A room can be original and still fail to communicate how people actually lived inside it. Winterthur's rooms aim for experiential truth, not architectural purity. To achieve this, Dupont and his team became master editors of history. When an 18th century house was facing demolition, Winterthur might acquire its paneling, doors, mantels, staircases, or flooring. These elements were catalogued, preserved, and later reassembled inside the museum, not as exact replicas of lost houses, but as compositions representing a broader cultural reality. This means a single room might contain walls from one house, a fireplace from another, and furniture from half a dozen different families. On paper, this sounds artificial. In practice, it is extraordinarily convincing. The proportions are right. The materials are right. The wear is right. Most importantly, the room behaves like a real room. Nothing is over-restored. Scratches remain. Paint layers overlap. Floors are uneven. These imperfections anchor the space in physical reality. Your senses accept it before your intellect has time to question it. This approach has sparked decades of debate among historians. Critics argue that Winterthur blurs the line between preservation and invention. Supporters counter that all museums interpret history, and Winterthur simply does so honestly, through space rather than text. What makes these rooms feel authentic is not their origin story, but their internal logic. Furniture fits the room's scale. Objects relate to each other functionally. Light enters as it would have historically. Even the sound changes as you move from room to room, shaped by ceiling height, materials, and enclosure. The illusion works because it respects how humans experience space. You don't analyze a room first, you feel it. And Winterthur is meticulously engineered to trigger that instinctive response. Perhaps the most unsettling realization is this. Many original historic houses feel dead because they are empty, sanitized, and over-explained. Winterthur's composite rooms feel alive because they are full, layered, and silent. They don't tell you what to think. They let the space speak. In this way, Winterthur challenges our assumptions about truth in museums. It suggests that emotional accuracy may matter more than literal reconstruction, that understanding the past requires immersion, not distance. By embracing illusion, Winterthur achieves something rare. It doesn't just show history. It convinces you, briefly, powerfully, that you are standing inside it. Behind Winterthur's quiet rooms and soft light exists a very different world, one of microscopes, databases, chemical analysis, and scholars arguing over millimeters of wood grain. While most visitors experience Winterthur as an immersive historical mansion, experts know it as one of the most influential research institutions in the world for material culture. This is where Winterthur's true power lies. From the beginning, Henry Francis du Pont did not envision Winterthur as a passive museum. He designed it as an active engine of knowledge. Objects were not meant to be admired and forgotten. They were meant to be studied, questioned, and reinterpreted. This philosophy transformed Winterthur into a global center for decorative arts scholarship. At the heart of this intellectual ecosystem is the Winterthur Program in American Material Culture, a graduate program so prestigious that it has shaped entire generations of curators, conservators, and historians. Alumni from this program now hold leadership positions in major museums across the United States, quietly spreading Winterthur's methods and values far beyond Delaware. Winterthur's scholars don't just ask what an object is. They ask how it was made, who made it, why it looks the way it does, and how it functioned in daily life. A single chair might be studied through archival records, tool marks, wood species analysis, and historical trade routes. Each object becomes a case study in American society. The conservation laboratories elevate this work even further. Here, Specialists analyze pigments, fibers, metals, and finishes at microscopic levels. They can identify original surfaces hidden beneath centuries of repairs. They can distinguish between historical wear and modern intervention. This scientific rigor protects the collection from guesswork and romantic assumptions. What makes Winterthur unique is the integration of scholarship into the museum itself. Research does not happen in isolation. It informs how rooms are assembled, how objects are placed, and how narratives evolve. Winterthur's displays are not fixed, they change as knowledge changes. This intellectual humility is rare. Many museums present their interpretations as final truths. Winterthur treats them as hypotheses, always open to revision. Labels are minimal because the objects are expected to speak for themselves. But behind that silence is an enormous volume of research. Winterthur's library is another hidden giant, housing hundreds of thousands of books, manuscripts, pattern books, auction catalogs, and estate inventories. It is one of the most important resources for understanding how Americans furnished their lives. Scholars travel from around the world to access materials that exist nowhere else. The result is a museum that influences history without shouting. Winterthur does not chase trends or spectacle. Its authority comes from depth, patience, and evidence. This makes it less visible in popular culture, but more powerful in shaping how American history is taught, preserved, and understood. In a world increasingly driven by speed and surface-level storytelling, Winterthur stands as a quiet counter-argument. It insists that understanding the past requires time, discipline, and respect for material evidence. That may not be loud, but it is enduring. At Winterthur, history does not end at the edge of the mansion. It dissolves into soil, light, shadow, and time. Spreading across more than 1,000 acres, Winterthur's gardens are not ornamental grounds designed to impress from a distance. They are a carefully orchestrated landscape experience, one meant to be walked, felt, and slowly absorbed. Henry Francis du Pont did not see gardens as decoration. He saw them as emotional architecture. Where many great estates rely on rigid geometry, axial symmetry, and formal dominance over nature, Winterthur does the opposite. Its gardens unfold gradually, almost secretly. Paths curve instead of announcing themselves. Views are revealed, then concealed. You are never given the whole picture at once. This sense of discovery is intentional and deeply psychological. Dupont believed that movement creates meaning. As you walk, your perspective constantly shifts. A dense woodland suddenly opens into a meadow. A narrow path releases you into light. Water appears where you don't expect it, then disappears again. These transitions mirror the interior experience of Winterthur, where one room never prepares you for the next. Seasonality is not a feature here. It is the core concept. Winterthur's gardens were designed to change dramatically throughout the year. Spring overwhelms the senses with color and abundance. Magnolias, azaleas, cherries, and bulbs competing for attention. Summer calms the palate, focusing on layers of green, texture, and depth. Autumn introduces restraint, carefully timed bursts of color surrounded by space and shadow. Winter strips everything down to structure, revealing branches, landforms, and design skeletons usually hidden by growth. This constant transformation ensures that Winterthur can never be fully captured in a single visit. Like the interiors, the gardens reward repetition. They are meant to be remembered, revisited, and reinterpreted over time. What makes the gardens extraordinary is how controlled they are beneath their natural appearance. Every tree placement matters. Sightlines are calculated. Water systems are engineered to feel spontaneous. Meadows are managed to appear wild without ever becoming uncontrolled. Nature here is choreographed, but never feels forced. The scale of the landscape plays a crucial psychological role. At over 1,000 acres, Winterthur overwhelms your sense of boundary. Modern life recedes. Roads disappear. Buildings vanish. The estate becomes its own world, insulated from contemporary noise and urgency. Time slows, not because you are told to slow down, but because the environment leaves you no choice. The gardens also function as emotional counterweights to the interiors. After moving through rooms dense with history, objects, and cultural memory, the landscape releases pressure. Space expands. Sound changes. Your body relaxes. This rhythm, compression inside, expansion outside, is one of Winterthur's most sophisticated design achievements. Plants themselves become historical documents. Many species reflect American horticultural trends across centuries, quietly echoing the timeline inside the mansion. Without signs or labels, the gardens teach history biologically, season by season. In the end, the gardens complete Dupont's vision. They ensure that Winterthur is not simply a museum of objects, but a fully immersive environment, one where history is not frozen behind glass, but alive, growing, fading, and returning again. At Winterthur, the past does not just sit still, it breathes. Winterthur may feel quiet, restrained, even introspective, but its existence is rooted in one of the most powerful industrial fortunes in American history. Beneath the refined rooms and carefully controlled landscapes lies the explosive force that made it all possible: gunpowder, industry, and the rise of American corporate power. The Dupont family fortune began not with luxury, but with violence and necessity. In the early 19th century, the family built an empire supplying gunpowder and explosives to a rapidly expanding nation. Wars, railroads, mining, and industrialization all depended on DuPont products. By the time Henry Francis Dupont inherited his wealth, the family name was synonymous with American industrial might. Yet Winterthur represents a striking departure from the typical expressions of Gilded Age power. There are no towering facades meant to dominate skylines, no grand ballrooms designed for social competition. Instead, DuPont channeled industrial wealth into preservation, scholarship, and control of memory itself. This choice was not accidental. Henry Francis Dupont was acutely aware of the moral tension surrounding inherited wealth. He understood that industrial fortunes were often built at enormous human and environmental cost. Winterthur became his response, not an apology but a redirection. Rather than celebrating production, he chose to preserve craftsmanship. Rather than embracing modernity, he protected the past. In doing so, Winterthur reveals how America's industrial elite sought cultural legitimacy. By collecting early American objects, DuPont aligned himself with the nation's origins, positioning industrial wealth as a continuation of American tradition rather than a disruption of it. The mansion becomes a bridge between the handmade past and the mechanized present. This strategy mirrors a broader pattern among Gilded Age families, who used museums, libraries, and universities to convert economic power into cultural authority. But Winterthur stands apart because of its restraint. Dupont did not plaster his name across every surface. He embedded it quietly, through values rather than spectacle. The estate also exposes contradictions within American capitalism. The tools of industrial progress funded the preservation of a pre-industrial world. Mass production paid for the worship of handmade objects. Speed financed slowness. Winterthur exists because of these tensions, and never tries to resolve them. Walking through Winterthur, you sense the weight of this inheritance. The house feels controlled, measured, almost defensive. It reflects a man keenly aware that power, once accumulated, must be managed carefully. Excess is avoided. Silence is preferred. Permanence is the goal. In this way, Winterthur is not just a cultural institution, it is a psychological portrait of American industrial wealth seeking redemption through memory. It demonstrates how money can shape history not only by building factories, but by deciding what deserves to survive. Winterthur may not celebrate the DuPont fortune openly, but it could not exist without it. And in that quiet contradiction lies one of its most compelling truths. At most historic estates, architecture is the star. The building announces itself first, demanding admiration before anything else is noticed. Winterthur does the opposite. The mansion retreats. It softens its voice. In many moments, it vanishes entirely. This disappearance is not accidental. It is one of Henry Francis Dupont's most radical and carefully engineered decisions. Originally, Winterthur was a private family house, designed to function like a traditional country estate. But as Dupont's collection expanded, the building's role changed. Walls were moved. Corridors multiplied. New wings were added, not to display architectural bravado, but to create neutral frameworks for history to exist inside. Over time, the house stopped behaving like a mansion and began behaving like infrastructure. Architecture at Winterthur is deliberately submissive. Ceilings are adjusted to suit objects, not symmetry. Doorways shrink or widen depending on regional precedent. Hallways bend, narrow, or extend to control pacing. You are guided, slowed, redirected, often without realizing it. The building becomes a silent narrator. What's remarkable is how rarely you notice these manipulations. There are no dramatic staircases demanding attention. No sweeping axes pulling your gaze forward. Instead, the architecture dissolves into function. You remember rooms, not walls. Objects, not structure. History, not the container holding it. This creates a powerful psychological effect. As visitors, we are trained to read architecture as a symbol of power. At Winterthur, that expectation is quietly dismantled. Authority shifts away from the building and towards the objects inside. The mansion humbles itself. Even light plays a supporting role. Windows are positioned not to frame views outward, but to create historically plausible illumination. Artificial lighting is carefully calibrated to disappear, mimicking daylight without announcing itself. Shadows are soft. Glare is avoided. The goal is invisibility. Behind the scenes, however, the architecture is anything but passive. Hidden systems support climate control, structural reinforcement, and conservation requirements at a scale most visitors never imagine. Walls that appear centuries old conceal modern engineering. Floors that creak authentically rest on reinforced foundations. The illusion of age is protected by contemporary technology. This duality, visible restraint paired with hidden complexity, is central to Winterthur's identity. It mirrors the philosophy of the entire estate. What matters most should never shout. Perhaps the most telling detail is how easily visitors lose their sense of orientation. At Winterthur, you stop knowing where you are in the building. North, south, old wing, new wing, it all dissolves. This disorientation is intentional. It breaks the mental map of a house and replaces it with a map of experiences. You are no longer moving through architecture. You are moving through time. In many ways, Winterthur anticipates modern experiential design decades before it became fashionable. Today, museums speak openly about immersion, flow, and narrative space. Dupont implemented all of it quietly, intuitively, and without explanation. By allowing the mansion to disappear, Winterthur achieves something rare. The building stops competing with history and begins serving it. Architecture becomes an act of humility, one that reshapes how power, space, and memory interact. At Winterthur, the greatest architectural statement is knowing when not to be seen. Everything at Winterthur looks calm, stable, and timeless. That illusion exists only because an enormous amount of invisible labor is happening constantly behind the scenes. While visitors move quietly through historic rooms, a parallel world operates out of sight, one filled with microscopes, solvents, climate data, and forensic-level investigation. Winterthur's conservation program is not a support function. It is one of the institution's core identities. Objects do not simply age gracefully on their own. Wood warps. Textiles weaken. Metals corrode. Light destroys pigment. Time is relentless. Winterthur exists in a permanent state of resistance against decay. Conservators here work with a philosophy of restraint. The goal is not to make objects look new, but to stabilize them without erasing evidence of use. Every scratch, stain, and repair carries information. Remove too much and history disappears. Intervene too little, and the object may not survive. This balance requires extraordinary precision. Finishes are analyzed layer by layer to identify original surfaces. Fibers are examined to determine age and composition. X-rays reveal hidden joints, repairs, and structural weaknesses. Decisions are slow, cautious, and often debated extensively. What sets Winterthur apart is how deeply conservation is integrated into scholarship. Conservators collaborate with historians, curators, scientists, and archivists. An intervention is never purely technical, it is interpretive. Every choice affects how future generations will understand the object. Many conservation projects at Winterthur take years. Some never truly end. Objects are monitored continuously, responding to changes in humidity, temperature, and light. The museum itself is a controlled ecosystem, engineered to slow time as much as possible. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect is how conservation shapes display. Some objects are rotated off view to rest. Others are displayed under lighting levels so low that visitors barely notice. Yet those conditions may double the object's lifespan. These sacrifices are invisible, but essential. Conservation also exposes uncomfortable truths. Scientific analysis sometimes reveals that cherished assumptions are wrong. An object believed to be original may turn out to be altered. A finish thought authentic may be later. Winterthur does not hide these discoveries. It absorbs them. In this way, conservation becomes a form of historical honesty. It resists nostalgia. It privileges evidence over romance. It reminds us that the past is fragile and that preserving it requires humility. Most visitors never meet a conservator. They never see the lab. They never witness the debates. But every step they take through Winterthur is supported by this quiet, constant vigilance. The house looks timeless only because time is being actively managed. To understand Winterthur fully, you must step beyond its rooms and objects and enter the inner landscape of the man who created it. Henry Francis du Pont was not merely a collector. He was an architect of experience, memory, and control. Unlike flamboyant Gilded Age figures who thrived on public attention, Dupont was intensely private. He avoided social spectacle. He distrusted crowds. His comfort existed in order, repetition, and precision. Winterthur became the environment where these preferences could exist without compromise. Collectors often acquire objects to project identity. Dupont did the opposite. He erased himself. His presence is felt not through portraits or inscriptions, but through absences, the absence of chaos, of excess, of theatricality. Winterthur feels quiet because its creator required quiet. Psychologically, collecting offered a Dupont mastery over time. The modern world was accelerating. Industries expanding, cities growing, traditions dissolving. Winterthur functioned as a controlled counter-reality. Inside its walls, change slowed. Objects remained where he placed them. Light fell exactly as he intended. History obeyed rules. This need for control is visible everywhere. Rooms are composed with extreme discipline. Nothing is random. Even apparent disorder is intentional. Chairs are placed as if recently used, but never carelessly. Objects suggest life, not mess. This balance between realism and order reveals a mind deeply uncomfortable with unpredictability. Dupont's obsession with authenticity was not sentimental. He rejected idealized versions of the past. He preferred wear, evidence of use, and imperfect survival. These marks reassured him that history had endured pressure and could endure more. Winterthur also reflects Dupont's selective empathy. He was fascinated by domestic life, craftsmanship, and everyday labor, but always at a distance. The house invites immersion without participation. You observe lives lived by others, preserved but unreachable. This emotional separation allowed Dupont to engage deeply without vulnerability. In many ways, Winterthur functions as a psychological refuge, a place where complexity is managed, where beauty is stable, and where human behavior is legible through objects rather than interaction. It is intimate without being social. Opening Winterthur to the public did not contradict this psychology. It extended it. Visitors are allowed into Dupont's world under carefully controlled conditions. Movement is guided. Silence is encouraged. Interpretation is minimal. You are trusted, but only within boundaries. This is why Winterthur feels so different from other museums. It does not perform. It does not explain itself loudly. It assumes patience, curiosity, and respect. These expectations mirror Dupont's own values. Ultimately, Winterthur is not just a collection of American objects. It is a mental architecture, a physical expression of one man's response to impermanence. By organizing the past with such care, Dupont found a way to live alongside it. And in doing so, he left behind a place where visitors can momentarily experience that same stillness, order, and control, before returning to the noise of the present. At first glance, Winterthur feels unmistakably American. The furniture, the craftsmanship, the domestic scale, all speak the language of early American life. But beneath that surface lies a paradox that makes Winterthur far more complex. Many of its rooms are not rooted in a single place, or even a single building. They are imported, reconstructed, and reimagined. This raises an uncomfortable question. If America's most powerful material history is built from dismantled rooms, what exactly are we preserving? Henry Francis du Pont did not collect entire houses. He collected fragments, paneling, mantles, staircases, doors, often rescued from buildings slated for demolition. These architectural elements were then transported, catalogued, and recomposed inside Winterthur. In doing so, Du Pont created environments that feel deeply authentic, yet exist nowhere else in the world. Critics have long wrestled with this contradiction. Are these rooms American history, or are they sophisticated simulations? Winterthur refuses to offer an easy answer. What Du Pont understood is that American identity has always been composite. From its earliest days, the nation absorbed influences, materials, techniques, and ideas from elsewhere. Houses were modified, expanded, updated. Rooms evolved over generations. There was rarely a single original state. Winterthur reflects this reality. Its rooms are not snapshots of exact addresses. They are distillations of cultural patterns. They represent how Americans lived, not where they lived. This shift from geography to behavior is what gives the rooms their uncanny power. The result is a museum that preserves American identity as process rather than artifact. Styles overlap. Periods blur. Regions echo one another. You see how ideas traveled along trade routes, how immigrant traditions merged, and how practicality reshaped inherited forms. This approach also challenges modern expectations of preservation. Many historic houses prioritize stasis, choosing a single moment and freezing it forever. Winterthur embraces fluidity. It suggests that authenticity lies not in immobility, but in adaptation. There is also an ethical dimension. By removing architectural elements from their original context, Winterthur saves them from destruction, but also detaches them from place. This trade-off is deliberate. Du Pont prioritized survival over locality, memory over geography. Visitors sense this tension even if they cannot name it. Rooms feel real but placeless, familiar but unreachable. You are inside American history, yet nowhere on a map. In a country defined by movement, migration, and reinvention, this makes a strange kind of sense. Winterthur mirrors the American experience itself, assembled, layered, and continuously rewritten. Rather than undermining authenticity, imported rooms reveal its fragility. They remind us that history is not a fixed object. It is a negotiation between what survives and what is lost. At Winterthur, American identity is not preserved in stone. It is reconstructed, debated, and kept alive, room by room. At Winterthur, power does not always announce itself through politics, war, or industry. Often, it appears quietly, in fabric choices, furniture placement, and the organization of domestic space. To understand early American life, Winterthur asks us to recognize a form of influence that history has traditionally minimized: the power exercised by women inside the home. For centuries, domestic interiors were considered secondary to real history. Public life belonged to men. Private life was treated as background. Winterthur overturns this hierarchy by preserving the spaces where women shaped daily existence, taste, and identity. While many objects at Winterthur were made by male craftsmen, their selection, use, and survival were often determined by women. Household managers decided what was purchased, repaired, altered, or discarded. They controlled textiles, color, layout, and comfort, elements that defined how homes actually functioned. Textiles tell this story most vividly. Quilts, bed hangings, needlework, and samplers dominate many rooms, and none of them are passive decoration. They record labor, skill, patience, and personal expression. Each stitch reflects time invested, often invisible, unpaid, and undocumented. Furniture placement also reveals authority. Chairs arranged for conversation, tables positioned for work or gathering, storage designed around daily routines. These decisions shaped behavior, social interaction, and family hierarchy. Domestic space was a system, and women were its primary engineers. Winterthur's room ensembles restore this agency by showing objects in use, not isolation. You see how kitchens, parlors, and bedrooms functioned as centers of negotiation, instruction, and emotional labor. These were spaces where values were taught, relationships formed, and identities reinforced. Even absence speaks volumes. In many rooms, women are never named, yet their presence is undeniable. The house becomes a record of influence without authorship, authority without credit. By treating decorative arts as cultural documents rather than aesthetic footnotes, Winterthur elevates domestic power to its rightful place in history. It challenges us to rethink what counts as influence and where it occurs. The result is a more complete and more honest portrait of American life. Hidden beyond the mansion rooms and garden paths lies a place that rivals the collection itself in importance, and in many ways surpasses it. Winterthur's library is not a supplement to the museum. It is its intellectual backbone, the memory vault that allows everything else to exist with credibility. This is not a library designed for casual browsing. It is a working engine of American material history, containing hundreds of thousands of volumes, manuscripts, pattern books, auction catalogs, trade records, estate inventories, photographs, and design documents. The Winterthur Library is one of the most important repositories of decorative arts knowledge in the world. Many of its materials exist nowhere else. While the rooms upstairs show what Americans lived with, the library reveals how and why those objects came to be. It documents decisions, transactions, aspirations, and anxieties, captured not in grand narratives, but in receipts, sketches, and marginal notes. Pattern books are among its greatest treasures. These volumes show how design ideas traveled across oceans and generations. A motif printed in London might appear years later in a rural American chair. Through these books, scholars trace influence, imitation, and transformation, watching American taste slowly separate from European precedent. Estate inventories offer an even more intimate view. Room by room, object by object, they reconstruct daily life after death. What mattered enough to record? What was valuable? What was ordinary? These lists allow Winterthur scholars to verify room ensembles, test assumptions, and challenge romanticized interpretations of the past. Auction catalogs preserve moments of cultural transition when objects left private homes and entered the market. Marginal notes reveal prices, desirability, and changing taste. They show how value is assigned, forgotten, and rediscovered. What makes the library extraordinary is its integration with the museum. This is not an archive isolated from display. Research conducted here directly shapes how rooms are assembled, how objects are dated, and how narratives evolve. When new evidence emerges, Winterthur adapts. The library also preserves voices often missing from traditional history. Account books, correspondence, and domestic records reveal the economic and emotional labor of households. They give form to lives that left no monuments. Access to this knowledge is tightly controlled, not out of elitism but necessity. These materials are fragile, irreplaceable, and deeply specialized. Scholars travel from around the world to sit quietly at its tables, piecing together histories that could not be reconstructed anywhere else. In many ways, the Winterthur Library functions like a time machine with instructions. It does not tell you what to think. It gives you the tools to see clearly. Without it, Winterthur would risk becoming a beautiful illusion. With it, the museum becomes evidence-based, self-correcting, and intellectually alive. The rooms may capture your imagination, but the library protects the truth behind them. For most of its existence, Winterthur was not meant for you. It was private, controlled, and inward-facing, a personal universe built by Henry Francis du Pont to house his vision of American history. Opening it to the public was not inevitable. It was a calculated risk, one that threatened to undo the very control that defined the place. Turning a private obsession into a public institution is never neutral. It changes who holds authority over meaning. Dupont understood this tension better than anyone. By the time Winterthur opened as a museum, the collection had outgrown the logic of private ownership. The rooms were no longer expressions of personal taste. They had become national evidence. Keeping them private would have turned Winterthur into a sealed vault. Opening them invited interpretation, disagreement, and evolution. This shift marked a fundamental change in Winterthur's identity. The house stopped being a refuge and became a responsibility. Opening Winterthur required rethinking everything. Circulation had to accommodate visitors without destroying intimacy. Conservation standards had to protect objects from light, humidity, and human presence. Silence had to be preserved without enforcing reverence. The challenge was not just logistical, it was philosophical. Dupont's solution was restraint. Winterthur did not adopt the language of spectacle or mass entertainment. There were no dramatic entrances or theatrical narratives. Interpretation remained minimal. The house trusted visitors to meet it halfway. This decision shaped Winterthur's reputation. It never became a tourist spectacle, and never tried to. Instead, it became a place people seek out deliberately. Those who enter are invited into a slower rhythm, one that resists contemporary museum trends. Institutionalization also meant letting go. Once Winterthur became public, Dupont's vision could no longer remain static. Scholarship would revise room interpretations. Conservation discoveries would challenge assumptions. New generations would question choices he made. This vulnerability is often overlooked. Many collectors freeze their legacy to protect ego. Dupont allowed Winterthur to change. In doing so, he ensured its survival beyond his own authority. The transformation also redefined the meaning of wealth. Winterthur stopped being a symbol of private accumulation and became an act of cultural stewardship. Industrial fortune was converted into shared memory. Yet traces of its private origins remain. The house still feels selective, demanding, slightly aloof. It does not explain itself loudly or welcome indiscriminately. This is not a failure, it is the cost of integrity. Winterthur exists in a delicate balance between preservation and access, authority and openness, obsession and responsibility. That balance is what gives it credibility. By crossing the line from private world to public trust, Winterthur took its greatest risk and secured its greatest strength. By the time you reach the final rooms at Winterthur, something subtle has happened. You are no longer moving through a museum. You are moving through time, and not in a linear way. Winterthur does not present history as a straight path from past to present. There are no timelines marching forward. No heroic narratives pulling you toward progress. Instead, time folds in on itself. Centuries sit side by side. Moments repeat. Domestic life loops endlessly. This is what makes Winterthur so disorienting and so powerful. Most museums ask you to stand outside history and observe it. Winterthur asks you to step inside and slow down until modern instincts dissolve. The pace of the rooms retrains your attention. Silence replaces stimulation. Subtlety replaces spectacle. You stop scanning and start inhabiting. Nothing demands urgency here. Chairs do not shout importance. Objects do not compete. Rooms unfold patiently, rewarding those willing to linger. This design choice is radical in a world built on speed and distraction. Winterthur functions like a time machine because it reconstructs conditions, not events. It doesn't recreate famous moments. It recreates how life felt between them. The weight of a chair, the proximity of furniture, the intimacy of light. These sensory cues bypass intellectual analysis and trigger memory-like recognition, even for lives you never lived. This is why visitors often struggle to describe Winterthur afterward. There is no single highlight, no obvious climax. The experience resists summary because it operates below language. Time behaves differently here. A room from the 1700s feels emotionally closer than a digital screen in your pocket. The modern world begins to feel abstract, rushed, and strangely thin by comparison. You realize how recently and how abruptly human rhythms changed. Winterthur does not argue that the past was better. It simply allows you to feel how different it was. And that difference lingers. Unlike theme parks or immersive exhibitions, Winterthur never breaks character. There are no audio guides shouting facts. No projections animating walls. The restraint is total. The illusion holds because nothing disrupts it. In this sense, Winterthur is less about nostalgia and more about calibration. It recalibrates your sense of time, value, and attention. You leave more aware of material, space, and slowness. Sensitivities modern life rarely trains. This may be Winterthur's most subversive achievement. It does not entertain you into forgetting the present. It sends you back into it altered. By refusing to behave like a museum, Winterthur becomes something rarer, a place where history is not consumed, but encountered, where the past is not explained into submission, but allowed to exist on its own terms. Winterthur does not tell you who Americans were. It shows you how they lived. And once you have walked through that world, the present never feels quite the same. When you leave Winterthur, nothing dramatic happens. There is no grand finale, no final object demanding admiration, no sweeping conclusion explaining what you have just seen. Instead, you step back into the present quietly, almost reluctantly, carrying a sensation that is difficult to name. That feeling is the point. Winterthur does not try to impress you into submission. It does not overwhelm you with facts or spectacle. It does something far more challenging. It asks you to slow down long enough to notice how history actually lives, inside rooms, habits, materials, and daily routines. This is a place built on restraint, on silence, on the belief that meaning emerges not from excess, but from attention. Henry Francis du Pont understood something that modern culture often forgets. History is not made only by extraordinary moments. It is shaped by repetition, by domestic choices, by how people sit, eat, rest, gather, and decorate the spaces where their lives unfold. Winterthur preserves those moments, not as nostalgia, but as evidence. Walking through its rooms, you do not learn dates as much as you learn rhythms. You sense how slowly life once moved, how objects were meant to last, how spaces were shaped around people, not the other way around. And without ever saying it aloud, Winterthur forces a comparison with the present. What have we gained? What have we lost? And what do we no longer even notice? Winterthur offers no answers, only contrast. That may be its most radical act. In an age that explains everything instantly, Winterthur trusts silence. It trusts the intelligence of objects. It trusts that if you stand still long enough, history will reveal itself without being translated. This is why Winterthur endures. Not because it is beautiful, though it is. Not because it is wealthy, though it was built on immense fortune. But because it resists urgency. It preserves slowness in a culture addicted to speed. Winterthur does not ask to be consumed. It asks to be experienced. And once you've walked its rooms, followed its gardens, and felt time stretch and soften around you, the modern world feels louder, faster, less grounded. You realize how rare it is to encounter a place that does not demand your attention, but earns it. Winterthur does not celebrate wealth. It does not glorify power. It does not chase relevance. It simply preserves how life once felt, and trusts that this memory still matters. In doing so, it becomes more than a museum, more than a mansion. It becomes a quiet mirror, reflecting not just where we came from, but how far we have drifted. And that is why Winterthur stays with you long after you leave.